To today's Viraasat Lecture. I think the introduction for the speaker and the topics are there. I'll just use this opportunity first is to welcome Sudev, the speaker, to Baroda. And of course, we have a lot of the Haribhakti family also here today. So welcome to you all, and of course to all our esteemed guests. I think as usual, Baroda is known for its cultural sensitivity and sanskar nagari. So I think it's in order that we all put our phones on silent or on mode. I think it's so I think for the next 1 hour, I'm sure Sudev will enthrall us with some of the history that he has managed to put together. The relevant context, of course, is Baroda, but more of that to Sudev. Just a little bit about the trust. It's wonderful to see a full house here today. We did max out on the registrations, and thanks to the support we get from Alembic, we were able to organize some additional seating at the last minute. So we hope we've been able to accommodate everyone. Heritage Trust completed its 40 years in 2024. And we are happy to welcome 2025 with this lecture, and also welcome it with a full house, and glad to see you all here today. I take this opportunity to reach out to all Barodians that I think it's important. I think I was talking to some of our guests from Ahmedabad today, and they were talking about how much Baroda has to offer. And I think at times, as Barodians, we forget that how much Baroda has to offer itself. So I think it's important to keep these stories alive. Heritage is not just about buildings, it's about all the stories that put together have made us all collect here today. I think everybody has a story about Baroda that I'm sure they can share, and that becomes a part of the heritage as we go along. So like I said, Heritage Trust has finished 40 years of its existence. We are open for memberships, we are open for donations, we are open for a program like this costs a lot of money, but we host this annually. We do it free of charge because of the support that we get from all of you members and patrons. And we hope as an extension of all these activities that will continue as we go on forward. Without further ado, I invite Sandhya to introduce the speaker and the topic, and I hope you enjoy the next 1 hour that we have put together for you.
Thank you, Sam. Good evening, friends, again. There are many ways in which our past fascinates us, gently cajoling us to go back and uncover our roots, goading us to discover more about ourselves and where we have come from. Academia has evolved numerous subjects to help us on this journey: archaeology, history, architecture, linguistics, engineering, astronomy, sociology, to name a few. These are studies that delve backwards only to help humanity progress forward. Sudev Sheth is one such scholar, and his book, Bankrolling Empire, which I hassled the Baroda Book Center to get me ASAP a fortnight back, is truly unputdownable in the way he traces the amazingly formidable journeys of street-smart and financially astute Gujarati families, and the way they built, lost, and rebuilt their fortunes, bankrolling various political powers over centuries. From the Mughals to the European colonizers and the local rulers, to, in the case of the Lal Bhais of Ahmedabad, our contemporary times. Though Sudev Sheth was born in Canada and brought up in California, and currently teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, USA, his roots are very much in Baroda, where they still have a family home, though largely locked. He was introduced to me by my friend Professor Jaimini Mehta, also one of the founder trustees of Heritage Trust, who read his book and the fascinating history of the Haribhakti family of Baroda, who were financiers to the Gaekwads in the 1800s. Incidentally, Sri Arvind Haribhakti, a descendant of the family, was also a trustee of Heritage Trust for many years and contributed significantly to the Trust's understanding understanding of the history of Baroda, especially at a time that the trust was seriously engaged in trying to save the Sureshwar Desai Haveli that was then falling apart. Sureshwar Desai, after whom Sursagar is named, was also a major financer for the pre-Gaekwad rulers of Baroda.
Do you want to tell him?
When Maharaja Sayajirao established the Bank of Baroda in 1908,
No, I'm going to go onto the
it
podium.
introduced modern banking systems and marked the slow end of money lending.
He said that I should just walk up in the front.
The Viraasat Lecture by Sudev Sheth
No, I want to go on top. Just the front.
and the tremendous interest it has generated amongst Barodians
Let him know.
is hopefully a precursor to Heritage Trust planning several more engaging and interesting events throughout the year, and more Barodians becoming aware of and therefore concerned about saving and preserving the heritage of their own city. Friends, I present Sudev Sheth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Would you like?
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Am I audible?
Okay.
A very warm welcome to everyone in the audience today, and my heartfelt thanks to the Heritage Trust for the kind invitation to come back to a city that is very dear to my family's heart. My grandfather, who I never had an opportunity to meet, unfortunately, but I hear through tales was a wonderful cricketer and a thoughtful human being, graduated from Baroda College in 1946. My father, who's present in the audience, sitting in the second row, is also a graduate of MS University in engineering in 1981. And we have long association with the city and its residents, and somewhere instilled in me is some of the cultural values that this city is so well known for. So I'm very proud and happy to conclude a series of book talks in India with Baroda city. And thank you very much for being here. So what I thought I'd do, rather than jump straight into an academic talk, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to study this topic, since you might be wondering how a young boy from California ends up in the archives of Baroda city, Ahmedabad city, running around the country looking for interesting materials. So in 2008, when I graduated from UC Berkeley with an undergraduate degree, like most undergraduates, I had no idea what I would do next. And that's a good place to be if you're at a university with thoughtful professors and mentors. Two mentors in particular, Vasudha Dalmia, a well-known scholar of Hindi Sahitya, and Munis Farooqi, a well-known historian of the Mughal Empire, said to me, "It seems India is very close to your heart, and if you really want to study India and learn more about it, you can't just go back for 1 month visits. You must travel to India, you must study in India, you must fall in and out of love with people in India, and experience all that the country has to offer in a long period of time." So equipped with that knowledge and with the blessings of my parents and friends and family, I bought a one-way ticket in 2009 to New Delhi to begin a study in history at the JNU University, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Unknown to my parents at the time, I actually ended up purchasing, just to make sure this works here. Okay, so unknown to my parents at the time, I actually purchased a motorcycle to get around the city. And for those young people in the audience, if you want to buy a motorcycle, you may not want to tell your parents about that. I purchased a motorcycle, I was traveling around the city, and even though I was studying modern Indian history, I was struck immediately by the relics of a much distant past. So in the case of Delhi, you had monuments going all the way back to the Delhi Sultanate. You had monuments from the Mughal time period, including the famous Humayun's tomb. And in the countryside where I traveled with friends, places like Fatehpur Sikri, the Taj Mahal in Agra, museums which contain paintings and relics such as Akbar, spending time with the Jesuits on your left here, and finally my favorite, imperial feasting at the court. These images captured my imagination much more than what I was surrounded by in the modern period. So as I found myself sneaking into classes on Mughal history, the Mughal Empire, and all of these fantastical tales of the past, I couldn't help ask myself, what happened to this mighty empire that at one point controlled the majority of the subcontinent, and of which now we only have architectural remains, chronicles that document some of their activities, and memories passed down from generation to generation? What happened to this mighty organization? For those who are less familiar with the Mughal Empire, let me just say a couple of key words that you should take away from this talk. The Mughals were not indigenous to South Asia or to the Indian subcontinent. They were from a place called Fergana Valley in modern-day Uzbekistan. If anyone has been to Uzbekistan, you might know that it's a range of steeps that are very inhospitable, unlike the countryside of Baroda, for example, which is agriculturally rich, vast, and fertile. So it is in this context that many rulers who were emerging from the Fergana Valley had very little resources that they could exploit. And as family infighting grew and fewer opportunities remained for inferior branches of the family, they sought their fortunes elsewhere. It is in this context that Babur, one of the members of the Timurid lineage, was spending time in Kabul and the bazaars of Kabul, where he encountered dozens of Indian merchants who were trading their wares in the city. And it is by interacting with these merchants that he was struck with an amazing idea, which was, how about we try our luck in India? It was called Hindustan at the time. So after 4 unsuccessful attempts, on his 5th attempt, he successfully conquers northern India, arriving in Agra. Like most people of the time, especially those coming from Central Asia, India was not a particularly hospitable place, and they found it a challenging environment. First of all, there were no warm baths to be had. It was cold water baths. I think today people still take cold water baths in India, so that's something that they didn't like. They didn't like the fact that there were no delicious fruits to be had according to their own taste, right? They were used to muskmelons, watermelons, and other kinds of fruits, and at that time, India didn't have that type of fruit available to them. Mostly, they didn't like the humid environment of India, which damaged weaponry, which damaged houses and infrastructure, and most importantly, members of the Mughal entourage found it inhospitable and they missed their homelands. In this context, half of Babur's entourage said, bye-bye, we're not staying in India, we're going back to Fergana Valley. So equipped with half his entourage, Babur still stuck to his roots and his entrepreneurial gusto, and he said to his entourage, listen, India might be a very difficult place to live, it is inhospitable, but let me tell you a secret about India. India has sophisticated counting systems. And for Babur, this suggested that there was immense wealth to be had in this particular part of the world. And he gambled correctly. It is in this context that he established a fledgling little empire in and around Agra, one that his son, but especially his grandson Akbar, grew to great heights. It is important to note that Akbar, when Humayun passes, his father, inherited nothing by way of monumental architecture, by way of a robust treasury, by way of an entourage. He was truly an entrepreneurial figure that took the seedling of an idea, that was the Mughal Empire, and grew it through a combination of military conquest, which required immense resources and gusto, administrative growth, so establishing systems by which people could come join the Mughal Empire, work for the empire, earn a salary, and make the Mughal Empire a part of their future. And finally, and most importantly, through alliances with local kings that he could either subdue through military action or that he could incorporate into his vision through marriage alliances and through tributary agreements, right? It's much better to make alliances that suit both sides than outright conquest, because conquest is expensive, it's violent, and it disrupts agrarian surplus, which the empire needed so badly. Rather than focus on the high tide of the Mughal Empire, so most things that we're familiar with, right? The Taj Mahal, Fatehpur Sikri, imperial feasting, the harem, all the riches that the Mughal Empire had, I was interested in a much different question, which is how did the empire decline and what happened in its aftermath? So rather than tell you in words what I was thinking, how about I just show you a quick 30-second clip, which is the last 50 years of the Mughal Empire. And as you watch this clip, I'd like you to pay attention to one thing. Notice how when the empire expands in the late 17th century, you'll see a Swiss cheese model of decline developing up in the north here. For all the business folk in the audience, you know that if the firm grows too quickly, there's a possibility of implosion or internal capacities limited. So here you'll notice that as the Mughal Empire tried to expand further south, it lost its existing strongholds in the north. And you can see that by the late 18th century, even though the Mughal Empire collapses here, new forms of authority are emerging in other parts of the subcontinent. Let me show you 3 more maps to document this change over time, just to give you a much better sense of what we're talking about. So the first map is here, India in the 1700s, and you'll notice that majority of the subcontinent is captured here by the Mughal Empire. By 1750s, you have several confederacies competing for control over India's resources. So for example, here you will have the Mughal Empire located in Delhi and Agra. You'll have the Rajputs in Rajasthan, the Sikhs north of that, and of course, a huge belt of land controlled by members of the Maratha Confederacy coming out of Satara and expanding northward into a very agriculturally rich region of the country, and a few others located in the subcontinent. By 1810s, the landscape changes entirely. The landscape starts to resemble your grandmother's quilt. It's a patchwork of different organizations and groups vying for authority, and in this world of fragmented authority, more and more people want a piece of the pie. Okay? So you can see that by 1800s, the early 1800s, it's dizzying to figure out who controlled what part of the subcontinent. It is also why every other person that you meet in India says, my dada and my pardada was an emperor or a prince or a nawab. Right? We all have a nawab in our family somewhere. And part of that might be true.
Yeah.
Part of that might be fiction. But the idea of indigenous rulers is a part of our psyche. And this is the reason for why that is the case. Now, equipped with a lot of these understandings initially of how history happens, in my new book, Bankrolling Empire, which is available outside, I sought to ask 2 questions. The first question was a very empirical question, a very practical question. How does a local person experience an empire that is collapsing or that is declining? And the second question is, by what mechanisms do new people consolidate authority, consolidate power, and influence the environments that they are part of? So it's a 2-part question. How do you experience decline, and how do you experience innovation and new forms of growth in its aftermath? How do you start telling a story like this? It's very challenging. And I'm very fortunate that a founding member of the Heritage Trust, Arvind Haribhakti, in the 80s, found a range of materials in the Haribhakti Haveli in the old city. And rather than disposing of them or trashing it, which is very common, by the way, in India, we don't like to recall the deeds and activities of people who are no longer around us. And there are robust traditions in this country of burning materials or throwing it away. He was unconventional, and he donated this material to the MS University in Baroda. I know this because a very kind mentor and a wonderful historian of Gujarat, Professor Samira Sheikh, told me that she had memories in the 1980s of this material being donated, but not much being done with it, and that I, as a young graduate student in 2014, should certainly make a trip to Baroda and have a look. So when I arrived in Baroda, I was very pleased. I was also overwhelmed. I was also excited to encounter a wonderful treasure trove of materials which are held at the MS University in Baroda. And with the support of faculty members at the university and then later members of the Haribhakti family, we were able to begin the process of disentangling this material and trying to make some sense of it. And I would be dishonest if I told you I have studied the entire archive. I've probably studied 1% of the archive. 99% of the work remains to be done. So young people in the audience, I invite you to join me and explore this archive and write your own history along what I've done, okay? What was amazing after looking at this material is an insight that I got that I probably wouldn't have had if I hadn't seen this material. And that insight was simply this. It became very clear and evident quickly that local financiers in Baroda were not only important for building wealth and resources, but that the Gaekwad state could not have functioned without the services and the capital provided by these banking families. Okay? So here you have a situation where you have specialization. The Gaekwad specialized in military statecraft. They specialized in harnessing new resources through conquest. But essentially, they came from a culture of banditry. And they needed service gentry, they needed people to be able to organize their administration and help them effect rule. So the Haribhaktis were the most prominent of this group, along with 4 or 5 other banking families in the city. Equipped with this knowledge, I asked myself another question. If the Haribhaktis were so central to Gaekwad power in this city, beginning in the late 1700s, what about the Mughal period? Were there bankers and financiers involved early on? And if so, who were they? Unfortunately for us, unlike Europe, where you have the Medicis, for example, in Italy, or the Rothschilds in France and England, or the Fuggers in Germany, they have robust archives that they've preserved generation after generation. You can go to Paris, for example, and you can attend workshops, you can study at the Rothschild archive, for example. It's a nice air-conditioned room, certainly not like this room where I spent many days, right? And you can look at the material at your leisure, and it's all cataloged, it's all sequenced, and you can write a robust history of banking and finance in these parts of the world. Imagine the magnitude of this. Knowledge is power. And if we're able to write histories of places around the world using this material, what do we do with a place like India where we have scarcity of material and scarcity of organization of that material, right? So we're much behind in that respect. We have to catch up still. But that didn't faze me. Even though we don't have a robust archive of a single business family from the Mughal times, which is much earlier, for example, recall what Babur said, right? It's humid and hot, and environmental conditions make it very difficult to preserve materials in this country. So a lot of that has been lost to us. I was not fazed, even though there's no single archive for a Mughal financier family as such. I challenged myself. I said, there has to be a different way. We have to find other avenues to build this history. So I relied on a very different strategy. Growing up in a family that values poetry, music, and the arts, I thought to myself, wait a minute, we do have traditions of history writing. They might not be strictly archival in the Western sense, but we have a sense of itihasa, we have a sense of the past, and we have a sense of telling stories about people and places. So here's what I did. I compiled a range of materials across languages, some of which I had to learn, by the way, which is also a few years of effort and dedication. And of course, I also drew on the help of supporting scholars and people who knew languages better than I to compile my views about this time period. The sources in red are the most critical sources for my new book, and they also represent a new frontier in historical thinking. These are sources that have largely either been ignored, not tapped into well, or not discussed by historians in any significant fashion. So you can see by looking at this that you need a combination of languages. Unlike us, we're monolingual or maybe bilingual at best. India is much better because at least people are bilingual or trilingual. In the US, everyone is monolingual for the most part. But the people that we're talking about during that time period were much more cosmopolitan than us. Without YouTube, without Instagram, and without the internet, they knew multiple languages. They knew how to access different registers of thinking and being. And a lot of their activities, therefore, have also been recorded in multiple languages. So for those of us who are just focusing on one set of materials in one language, you're missing out on a much larger tapestry that you could tap into. Let me give you a sense of what these materials look like physically, because they're also quite interesting. Here's a very interesting document. This is an early farman offered by a major business family, which I'll discuss in a minute, to Murad Baksh, who was one of the 4 fighting princes of Emperor Shah Jahan in 1658 in Ahmedabad. And this loan is for 5.5 lakh rupees, 550,000 rupees. To give you a sense of how much that is, that might sound like an insignificant sum to some people here, or it might sound like a huge sum to some people here. So let me balance it out by saying that 10 kilograms of wheat, which was a daily necessity, would cost 1 rupee. Processed indigo, which was a very expensive commodity, would cost between 5 and 16 rupees. Unfortunately, the buying and selling of children as slaves and adults as slaves would cost between 2 and 4 rupees. And the daily wage of an unskilled laborer would be something like 1/20th or 1/10th of a full rupee. Right? So 550,000 rupees on the spot by a single banker was a sizable sum. This amount would buy you a provincial army of 2,000 people for at least a month or two, including their food, their provisions, their military armaments. So for a family to provide a single loan for this amount of money on the spot is fairly significant. Okay. A second set of materials, which is also very important, are praise poems and literature emanating from religious communities. So here is a very good example of a prashasti. I hope you can see in the back. Is it okay if I'm up here? Okay, good. I'll keep moving so that you can have a look. A prashasti is a praise poem written in multiple languages. This one happens to be in Sanskrit. But this is why you must look at multiple materials. This praise poem commemorates the building of the Chintamani Parshvanath temple in the 17th century in Ahmedabad. And this temple was desecrated by Aurangzeb. So we don't have any physical remain of this particular temple, or Derasar more accurately. But we do have this wonderful prashasti, which was only discovered in 1950.
Right.
So here you have a wonderful source that is critical to the puzzle, only emerging in the 20th century, suggesting that more work has to be done. But nonetheless, this source is very crucial for me. Not Persian language, not coming from the Mughal state, but coming from the religious communities in the city. We're not supposed to have favorite sources as historians. We're supposed to be unbiased. But I do have bias. I'm a human being after all. Let me show you my favorite source. This is the unpublished diary of a low-level Mughal bureaucrat spending time between Baroda, Khambat, incidentally my father's birthplace, Ahmedabad, and Surat. It's 489 large folios, and it is incomplete. We know that is incomplete because at the bottom of the page, of every page, they write the word that appears on the next page to ensure that folios or pages are not separated. So the last page here does have a catchword, we call it, but no pages to follow. So it's 489 pages. This man had a lot more to say, but unfortunately, that aspect is lost to us. Still, this source is very important, held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. Beautiful manuscript, a delight to look at, but very important because it fills in gaps about local knowledge. If I, as a low-level professor at a university, keep a diary and I write down everything I observe in my day-to-day activity, you would get a very different perspective than if the president of the university wrote a diary. So it is for this reason that Itamad Ali Khan's diary is a very important source. He compiles news reports for us every day and provides summaries. He provides ethnographic observation about what's happening around him, including several episodes about Baroda, which are extremely, extremely rich in description. And he talks about his own dreams and aspirations. It's amazing. He's no different than us. He wants better opportunities. He wants a salary bump. He hopes that his environment is peaceful and happy. And like an aging person of any time, he's lamenting how good the good old days were, right? So it's really nice to look at a diary like this. And let me show you a final set of materials just to give you a visual sense of how they look. These are materials emanating directly from Baroda. So on the left, you have a sample of a document coming from the Haribhakti collection at the MS University in Baroda. And what I learned in the course of my research with the support of Gopal Bhai and Swati Ben Haribhakti, who are sitting in the front row here, that some branches of the family have still important documents that they've preserved across generations. And it is to their credit that they allow a scholar to come in without any interference to look at the materials and discuss and debate what these materials contain. Intellectual honesty is the best place to start, and I've been fortunate that this family and also the Javeris, the Lalbais of Ahmedabad, have not interfered in how I've written my story. They may not agree with everything I say, but it's testament to this being Sanskriti Nagar or Sanskar Nagar that they're supportive in that endeavor. But this just tells you that the work is just beginning. So here's an example of a jute scroll, and several dozen of these exist in the possession of the family, and they document the early history of the Haribhakti firm being established in this city in around between 1760 and 62, right? very, very early on, and a very important document for our purposes. But don't worry about the specifics. All I want you to understand from the last 4 slides is the diversity of material, how different it looks, the script, the style, the pagination, the color, the black and whiteness of it, right? And the different formats that you're dealing with. And this is what is required if you're to write a history of this particular time period. Now, what I learned by examining a lot of this material is something very interesting, that if you want to understand political power, you should not look to the state, or you should not look to powerful people. You should look to the service gentry who is servicing those people or who is working with those people. Because chances are they're lurking in the shadows, and they're much more important possibly than those who are in the limelight. I always tell people, if you want to know about my household, don't ask me, you should really ask my wife. She knows what's happening in the household. Or like my mother in my own household, right? My father might be the limelight at times, but mothers always know what's really happening in the household, right? So much like that, you can see that service gentry and those who are not in the limelight often have interesting things to say. So what I learned by looking at this material is that 2 prominent business families in Gujarat were very important to the rise and fall of political power. They did not look like this, but the families have survived over time, and this is the modern iteration of the family. So one family is the Javeris of Ahmedabad, also known as the Lal Bhais of Ahmedabad, and for those who follow brands, it's the Arvind brand. So this family has been around for a very long time. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the family entered industry through cotton trading, built some of the first mills in Ahmedabad, and then they've modernized over the 20th century. By the way, that story is not linear. So don't assume that it's perfectly symmetrical and it's always growth. There's moments of punctuated change, challenges along the way. Rather than jeans and denim, which is also interesting, I understand, I was much more curious and much more drawn to the earlier history of the family. So the Lal Bhai family history and legacy goes back much further in time to the Mughal Empire. And here's the founding patriarch, Sheth Shantidas Javeri, who you may have heard of. And my favorite character, again, not supposed to have favorites, but I do, Khushal Chand Javeri, who was a 3rd generation financier, banker, and jeweler in Ahmedabad, and the grandson of Shantidas. So these 2 characters emerge very central in the book that I write. To give you a sense of the lineage, I used the Prashasti to recreate one branch of the lineage. It's much more complicated after Kasturbai, but just to give you a sense of how long and deep the history goes, it looks something like this. So while the red arrows represent the modern iteration of the family, the blue arrows represent the characters I feature in my book. The other remarkable family that emerges through my research is Baroda-based, and very much a family that's tied to the fortunes of the city, and that is the Haribhakti family of Baroda. It is also because of the genuine support of Swati and Gopal Haribhakti that we were able to find this image of the 2 brothers, which is rare, by the way. Pictorial evidence from this time period is extremely rare, so the little that we have, we should grab and preserve and think about, really. This also gives you some clues of their orientation and perhaps the kind of image that they would like you to take away from their character, right? So you can use your imagination and think about that. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about that if you're curious. So here's the Haribhakti family tree, again simplified for ease, but what I want you to know here is that it is various branches of the family who have kept collections. Unfortunately, one branch of the family, most of that collection was lost in fires in Surat, environmental conditions, but we do have 2 prominent family branches that are preserving papers and have contributed to the history that I write. Arvind Haribhakti, as I mentioned, was a founding trustee of the Heritage Trust too, which I just learned today, by the way. So how wonderful is that connection? It's coming back full circle. So to give you a sense of the geographical location, it is Western India, you all know that, but Ahmedabad and Baroda were really part of the same political sphere. Today, we like to think of Baroda as very different from Ahmedabad, and I know there's rivalries between these 2 cities, but in those days, the rivalries were less so, and these 2 cities were very close together. Let me tell you what I did. So as I thought about these 2 business families, I said to myself, what would a history look like if we map those families to political developments of their age, right? So simply, if you look here, you'll have the Mughal family tree on the left, and you'll have the Javeri family tree on the right. And I think I'm one of the first scholars to actually systematically try and map these relationships over a period of time. Similarly, for the Haribhakti family and the Gaekwads of Baroda, you'll notice that relationship is very similar. Over generations, different members of both sides of the family tried to build relationships. It was not conflict-free, right? Like any good relationship, you have to have moments of disagreement, falling in and out of love, and figuring out solutions to new problems. So for both families, that relationship was a very difficult one. For those who are into political financing in this room, I don't know who's into political financing, but if you're donating to political parties, you know it's laden with risk, especially in the democratic system. You might donate to the Democrats and they might lose, or you might donate to the Republicans and they might lose. And you might face setbacks along the way, right? So political financing is a very difficult business, but these two families tried their luck at it, and in some cases were very successful in doing that. So as I built my argument and my materials, by the end of my research, I want to share with you a big takeaway. For those of you who are light readers and don't prefer an academic book, you should pay attention here for the next 30 seconds, and I'll give you the Twitter version of the book, okay? The book traces 4 major phases in how we should understand Indian history and how we should understand the relationship between those who are in the business of business, making money, and those who are in the business of politics, building governments, building institutions, building capacity to grow over time. And those are captured in 4 phases, which I trace over time. So in some senses, you might want to think of this as a progression. On the left, the first phase, which is something like going from the late 1500s up until the mid 1600s, is what I'm calling courtly mutualism. And all that means is that relationship between these two groups was largely friendly, mutualistic, and co-beneficiary. So both sides benefited from the goods and services that the other provided. To give you a quick example, the Mughals were fond of achari mirch, bataka or batata, which was a New World crop, tomatoes, tomato, which were not part of our diet prior to 1600. And as the Portuguese brought these to India, they took great delight in eating these objects, right? You can't imagine Gujarati food today without bataka nu shaak, right? But in those days, they weren't having that. So they used merchants like the Javeris to procure those goods from the ports, in addition to jewels, silver bullion, and other valuable commodities for the court. In return, the bankers benefited by protection from the state, roads being guarded as they moved money and commodities across space, and occasionally, when there were disputes, governors would step in to ensure that the safety was maintained of these particular bankers. The second phase is what I'm calling political commensalism. And political commensalism simply refers to this relationship. I'll just wait. Thank you, no problem. The second phase is what I'm calling political commensalism, which is simply that this relationship is moving to one where money is becoming a very important resource in political life. In this phase, it was outright war and outright conquest that was very responsible. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
It was war and outright conquest that sustained the empire in this phase. In the second phase, political commensalism is simply that money was becoming a new resource that princes needed to effect change. I'll say more about that in a quick second. The third phase is this relationship of commensalism, or money being lent to princes to fight wars, transforming into a very, very sinister phase, which is that of extortion. This is when princes, especially young Mughal princes and their governors, realize that the Javeris are no longer forthcoming with their money because they're not being paid back, and the only way to get that money is through physical extortion, manipulation, and imprisonment. So this third phase is a very challenging and tough phase, beginning in the late 1600s and continuing all the way into the 1730s, when bankers and financiers had a very tough time, right? Not to make too many strange parallels, but it is possible that if you believe in this way of thinking, the 1950s onward until liberalization was a pretty tough period for business in India, if you believe in that school of thought. So obviously they weren't extorted and imprisoned and lashed in public, but they faced challenges. So similarly, during this period, business faced major challenges. And the last phase is a resolution or a conclusion or a kind of finality to this entire process, what I'm calling competitive co-parcenary. This is when business realizes that tying their fortunes to just government in a strict lending fashion is not sustainable anymore. but rather they have to implicate themselves into the structures of the government. They have to become financiers to the government, they have to become treasurers to the government, and they have to involve themselves in the machinery of the government, right? So collecting revenues, collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, and so on and so forth. So without getting too technical, all that means is that the state starts to contract out services to these service providers, much like governments do today. In many parts of the world, a government will contract out their military force and have them do military work on the state's behalf. And there's private firms that specialize in this. You haven't heard of them because they're doing their job well, but they're making huge amounts of money doing that, right? So this is a good example of how that works. Let me give you a quick sense of each of these phases and the materials I used to study this, just so you get a sense. And I'll go quickly through this in the interest of time. Courtly mutualism, remember, that is the idea that business and politics are mutualistic and getting along, and they're benefiting from each other's services. This is Shantidas's period. What does this look like? Well, here's a farman from 1618 issued by Jahangir, the emperor, to the Shantidas Javeri family. And he says that Shantidas Javeri is now protected by the Mughal state, but such prized immunity does not come cheap. What does he have to do in return? Well, in return, he has to offer gifts and presents and every type of jewelry that he can procure to the exalted empire. And in return for that, no governors will interfere in his business. And we have several other farmans coming after this, scolding Shantidas, saying that you're keeping the best diamonds for yourself. We know that you're doing that. You better cough them up, otherwise we're going to give you a very difficult time. And by the way, send some achari mirch too, because we love those pickled peppers from Cambay, right? So that's the kind of relationship that they had. Similarly, from the Sanskrit sources, mutualism also emerges very, very clearly. So this is the Prashasti that I told you about, the Sanskrit praise poem. And simply here it says, for the sake of universal kingdom, Samrajya of the Mughal Empire, he, Shah Jahan, the emperor, displayed his favor in the form of horses, elephants, and gifts onto the shining little kingdom of Shantidas Javeri. So again, you see that in the Sanskrit sources too, the Jain vision of Mughal business relations is also mutualistic, okay? So it's not like what we hear in the newspapers today that the Mughals extorted and were nasty to every single community. No, it's much more complicated than that. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that it was only one particular way. They were much more complicated than we can imagine, perhaps. The second phase, political commensalism, as I mentioned to you, was when money starts becoming a very important resource in political activity. And this might sound familiar for large business families with brothers, as brothers are fighting for the throne. Okay? You have multiple brothers fighting for the throne, and rather than just talking it through, which is expected in modern times, in those days, fratricide was very common. Fratricide means the physical elimination of a brotherly rival, or a father for that matter, patricide. This is a good example. This is the Battle of Samugarh. This is a first major battle between princes fighting for the throne after Shah Jahan's death. Aurangzeb, Murad Baksh, Dara Shuko, right? And a final fourth prince. And this is actually a contemporaneous painting from that time period. So what I want you to take away from this is the immense resources required for a battle of succession, which you can't anticipate and you can't plan for. You wake up tomorrow and it's battle time. So in that context, you may have a treasury that's depleted and you may not have the resources to fight that particular battle. So what do? You ask the Javeris for a loan. This is that same loan I told you about, 5.5 lakh rupees, and we have several loans like this that were provided to the family, provided by the family to princes fighting for the throne. What's interesting about this particular loan, apart from its details, which basically say that a loan was provided from Manik Chand, the son of Shantidas and the business fraternity, to Murad Baksh, and the details of how it's going to be repaid sometime in the future are provided below. For those, again, who follow political financing, it's not relevant to have finance off-season, right? You need money during the election season, not afterward. So similarly, you need that, okay? What I want you to take away from this is that the family backed a losing prince. They backed Murad Baksh, not Aurangzeb. And despite this, when Aurangzeb defeats all his brothers, including killing Murad Baksh, the family goes to Delhi to the coronation of Aurangzeb and says, by the way, we know we provided your family a loan. Too bad we picked the wrong prince. But how about that 5.5 lakh rupees that we gave you, right? Aurangzeb now, recall earlier he desecrated Shantidas's temple, but now, as an emperor, his views changed. He repaid that entire amount and said, go back to Ahmedabad and tell the business fraternity that we're here to support you and support your activities, and that institutions will be maintained. Again, characters change over time and their priorities change over time. The third phase is the sinister phase I was telling you about, what I call expedient extortion, the violent lashing, beating, and extortion and imprisonment of local bankers. In this case, Kushal Chand Jhaveri, the grandson of Shantidas. But don't feel too sorry for Kushal Chand, because as every good banker, he was hedging his bets, and he emerges in the sources as a very multidimensional figure. Just like all of us, if you catch us on any particular day, we might behave differently than how we may have behaved 2 days ago, right? So again, it's important to paint historical characters with as much complexity as we can possibly imagine. Okay? No one reason for why they do something, there are multiple reasons for why they do it. But let me tell you about this incident. It happens in Bhadra Fort in Ahmedabad, for those people who are familiar with Ahmedabad. And again, like a bad historian, I snuck into this particular monument with the local guard, so I was very careful. But I spent a lot of time walking inside its halls and spent some time here. This happens to be the prison of the fort. It's not a very nice place to be, but unfortunately, Kushal Chand spent many nights in this particular prison. Why did he spend many nights in that prison? Well, governors were not happy with the fact that he stopped lending money to them, and he was being wishy-washy about how much money he actually had. Let me tell you how this plays out by giving you an example from Itimad Ali Khan's diary. So note the details in this diary. This is Kushal Chand, and this is one particular governor, which you'll learn about in a quick minute. So what I want you to take away from this quick set of episodes is how Kushal Chand starts to realize, wait a minute, there are no robust political leaders on the horizon. I must hedge bets and start lending to multiple sides to make sure that whoever comes to power has my support and whose support I also have in return. So this is the first time in recorded history that we see a banker developing a kind of political consciousness and start strategizing in that particular way. So let me just tell you what he does. He says, this is from the diary again, Hamid Khan, a renegade Mughal governor controlling Ahmedabad and its environment, including Baroda at the time, he tells Kushal Chand that 10 lakh rupees is required to pay the soldiers. Either raise the amount through taxes and fines from the people in the city, or you give it from your own banking house. In reply, Kushal Chand offers him that money, but then we have another episode. Hamid Khan continues to ask for more money, and yet another lakh was raised. There's dozens of episodes like this in sequence documenting several 100 lakh rupees being donated, right? Offered, provided, financed to this particular governor. And as this money is not going to be repaid, and when Kushal Chand realizes that, he offers his money to another rival governor in a very short period of time. So this is Sarbulan Khan, another rival governor. He asks for money. Kushal Chand says, I'm skeptical. I don't think you're going to give it back. If you really want me to raise the money, I can do it from other bankers in the city. Sarbulan Khan is very upset. He loses his temper. And he says, look, don't give this money to me as a donation. How about a loan with very generous terms? I'll give you jewelry as collateral. By the way, this is why most royal households have jewelry. It's not because it looks nice, although that is wonderful. It's because it's an asset that is movable, that is lightweight, and that is worth a lot of money. It's a storer of wealth, right? And this was very important in this particular economy because suddenly he can send it off as collateral. And on top of that, offer 25% by way of interest. And Kushal Chand, being a great banker, is now happy with this. And he quickly provides this money. Right? So this, you get a sense, right, of how Kushal Chand is. But let me tell you quickly why we should look at other sources too. This is a very early 18th century poem by Shamal Bhatt. For anyone who follows Gujarati poetry, an early 18th century poet. This is a shlok or a pavada in Marathi, if you follow Marathi, called Rustam no Shloko, means Rustam no Shlok. in Gujarati we say. And this is 1725. This poet is not patronized by any king or any landlord. He's an urban poet, and like most good urban poets, he's poor, and therefore has very little incentive to paint a one-sided picture. He's describing what he sees in the city, and he's narrating this to people who are listening to him orate this particular tale. Because at the end of the poem, he says, I don't have much. If you appreciated this story, you can give whatever you have to me. Why I like this particular poem is that Kushal Chand emerges here as a very different figure, as a figure that was a traitor to the city of Ahmedabad. If you ask Ahmedabadis today, they'll recall that Kushal Chand paid so much money to the Marathas and saved the city. Yes, he did do that also. But at the same time, he was also responsible for opening the gates of Ahmedabad city and allowing Hamid Khan to loot the city for 2 days straight. How do we make sense of this material? There's no one answer for why he did this. We still need to think deeply about how people behave and why they behave the way they do. So in this particular case, Shawal Bhatt says, look, these characters are moving about, fighting one another, Hamid Khan and Sarbulan Khan, and Kushal Chand Javeri emerges as a traitor. He says, look, why are you sitting around? We have been cheated. Our banker, Kushal Chand, is a traitor. He's not who we think he is, right? So this is why we have to locate multiple sources and try to paint a composite picture of characters as best as we can. What I want to end with in terms of the expedient extortion is that many other episodes emerge where Kushal Chand is beat, lashed, extorted, and we find episodes of how he navigated this by escaping to Cambay, going to Delhi, relying on his colleagues to help him, and in many cases also employing military men to safeguard his house in Javeri where he had immense wealth stored. Now let me tell you about the fourth phase, which is competitive co-parcenary, and this is kind of where Baroda bankers become interesting for us to think about. So if you look at a map of India in the early 19th century, I told you that at the end of this phase, you have your grandmother's patchwork quilt here, right? A map of India which is dizzying and hard to figure out. You ask any class 10 student to memorize this, and no wonder they don't want to study history, because this is really, really complicated and very, very dense. But if you look at Gujarat here, by 1818, this is the region that was controlled by the Gaekwads of Baroda, who were an offshoot of the Maratha Confederacy. And they consolidated authority, again, through military activity, through military entrepreneurship, if you want to call it. Even in some cases, you may say it's warlordism, right? Not warlordism in the sense that we may think of it, but certainly conquest, harnessing revenues, and settling lands. And by early 1818, with the intervention of the British East India Company, which really tried to control the subcontinent through military might, once again, you'll notice a thread, by the way. If you're strong militarily, you can accomplish a lot, right? The Gaekwad territory was disrupted into 4 different regions. Again, a patchwork quilt. It's very difficult to control this region because you have 4 divisions that are not even touching one another, okay? So it is in this context that bankers become really important, because there's no possible way that a centralized government based out of Baroda can easily control these territories with British interference in between, with a lot of native states in between. So for example, you have the Babis of Junagadh, the Nawabs of Jamnagar, and so on and so forth, right? There are a lot of different groups fighting for competition, and the Gaekwads of Baroda needed a service class to help them effect their political rule. So it is in this context that the later Javeris, here's Vakhat Javeri, who gets involved in this. He's from Ahmedabad, but he moves to Baroda, and he spends a lot of time with the early Gaekwads. I won't go into too much detail here because this is the end of the Javeris, and we have very little evidence after this period. But this is where the story picks up with the Haribhaktis of Baroda. So what I've tried to do is fill in gaps with this second remarkable family, which really helps us see how we get to this world of competitive co-parcenary, right? And what services they provided. So let me quickly run through that to give you a sense of the work that the Haribhakti firm did. These are 2 ordinary documents from the Haribhakti archive written by locals. So here's one written from Sankheda, from one Atmaram, a local person in Sankheda. He writes that there is a dispute pertaining to one Ganpat Rao, and he has been kept in prison with the guards. No one is opening their stores because of the chaos being caused by this. My business is going down. Please send some influential people. Desai Mithalal, Raghunath Desai, Vachiyat, and Kishandas Dalal. These 4 have surely been given handcuffs and kept in prison. I cannot speak of this in my hometown of Sankheda. I'm only telling you, I do not want to speak about it in my own Sankheda, since I am also from there. So this man is writing to the Haribhakti firm in Baroda saying that, look, this dispute has emerged. There might be some officials of the Gaekwad state who are either extorting these officials or imprisoning them. Rightfully so or wrongfully so, we don't know. But we're calling on you to help us. Please help us figure this out, right? This is one of thousands of disputes like this. A second one, right, from 1794. To the glorious city of Baroda and to the exalted banker, Shri Bhaktidas, to whom I send my salutations and good wishes. Again, you can see the language that's being used. This is in Old Gujarati, by the way. I'm writing because in my village, some government officials are sitting on the land and extorting 100 rupees per day from me. We are unable to resist such unfair treatment from the government officials and request you to intervene and help. Governance is a very complicated activity. No government can rule perfectly. And there are disputes that happen, right? And so here we have another example of the firm being called on to help with this. For their part, the Gaekwads had a very difficult task because as the Gaekwads consolidated authority in Baroda, they still had to send tributes to Satara, the capital of the Maratha Confederacy. So this just gives you a sense of how much money was owed by the Gaekwads of Baroda to the Peshwa between 1770 and 1798. You can see here, right? It's quite a big sum. It's 40 million rupees approximately. And that was amounted across several generations of the Gaekwad family. For a non-specialist, let me just say it very simply, and the details are provided in the book, that each year a Gaekwad ruler had to send an amount of money as tribute to maintain his gadi or his seat of authority here. And there was an element of extortion from Satara side as well, right? It was a tributary offering, not one that was calculated necessarily by any strict measure, but the Gaekwads were forced to send this amount if they wanted to maintain their seat of authority here. It was a very difficult task. And each passing year, they were required to send more and more cash, and they had very little cash of their own to send as tribute. This is where the bankers, like the Haribhaktis and many other local bankers come in to start providing those loans to the Gaekwad state so that they can send that money to Pune and Satara to ensure that the princely authority of the Gaekwad state is maintained. So the non-technical explanation for why this emerges, again, I'm happy to discuss more later, or you can look at the book too, but that's what I want you to take away from this. So it's not just people in the province or in the countryside complaining about extortion. In some senses, I would argue, based on my research, that the branches of the Maratha Confederacy, the families, the lineages, were also being extorted by the headmen back at home, right? We still have this system in our households too, right? Often there's a strong patriarch who might not be contributing very much to the family, but whose authority you value for certain reasons, and you listen to that person. And so similarly, you have this way of thinking about kingship in India that is very sticky. Even if the math doesn't add up, you still believe in the authority of that particular person. This happened with the Mughals also. It happened with the Gaekwads and the Marathas as well. So just to give you a sense of the kind of money that was borrowed, this is just one example among many, that by 1807, as the Gaekwads required much more capital to effect their rule in Baroda, they borrowed more and more money, not just from the Haribhaktis, but several other bankers in the city. The Haribhaktis were the most prominent. They were the lead lenders for those who follow finance. They were the ones who bundled the loans for the Gaekwad and served as the interface between local bankers and the Gaekwad state. So this is one example that by 1807, the British East India Company says, listen, Gaekwads, not only do you have to deal with your authority in Pune and Satara, you have to deal with us also, and we will take over your territory unless you discharge debts and unless you start paying your soldiers on time. And for that reason, the Haribhaktis and many other bankers, you can see Haribhakti here and the other bankers there, they came up with this amount of money by the end of 1807. This is one example. I don't want to get into too much accounting detail, but this happens year after year where much more money is required to finance state operations. What I want you to take away from all of this is something very interesting. Today, a state having debt is naturalized, right? The US has mounting debt every year. India also has that. Debt is a healthy element of being of growing capacity, of being creditworthy, and of using resources to expand possibilities. We're talking about a world where debt is only starting to emerge as something that can be used or leveraged to expand possibilities. The Mughals, for example, were not using debt at all. Whatever money came in is what was spent. They did not develop fiat currency, right? What we have today, a rupee that is kind of worthless, but we only believe it's worth something because the government says it's worth something. So it is in this time period that bankers start thinking in this way, and they start issuing their own currency. They start issuing hundis in their name. So a Haribhakti firm had their own hundi system, which was essentially book money. It's not necessarily money that's backed by a lot of silver, but because of their creditworthiness, you could use it as currency in the market. Again, not to get too technical, but it is a very important shift that we're talking about. And the Gaekwads and the Haribhaktis and these bankers were figuring it out as they went, which is why it's an imperfect system, but it is also interesting and an immensely pivotal moment in our history. By the way, debt was established in Europe much early on. This is why they were able to expand into industry very early on. For example, the Bank of England comes much before this, and they're issuing paper currency centuries before this, right? So we were kind of behind, if you want to use that language. I'm putting in quotations because we should not use such charged language, but just to give you a sense in terms of financial capacity, we hadn't developed that capacity yet to think about fiat currency. Okay? By 1830, these debts are growing so much so that a very interesting thing happens. The East India Company says, listen, Sayaji Rao II, no more debts, no more mounting payments. Year after year, we can't deal with this anymore. You must either settle all debts now, or we're going to take over the Gaekwad's entire dominion. And what Sayaji Rao II does is really interesting, and I think modernizing in some ways, even though it impacted local bankers negatively at that moment. He says, let me turn to my personal wealth, which the family had built, and I'm going to clear all the debts owed to all of these bankers, and I'm also going to give up certain villages and land that the Gaekwad has to make sure that we are no longer indebted to anyone. And he establishes Baroda's first bank. In contrast to what popular opinion is, it's not 1908 Bank of Baroda, no. It's Ganesh Ishwar Bank at Lakshmi Vilas Palace in 1830. Okay? And this is the first deposit bank that we have, and the first modern bank, I would say, that emerges. And guess who the chief banker is? It's not the Haribhaktis. They were part of it, but it's Sayaji Rao II. And here's Sayaji Rao II from an etched engraving from the 19th century. And it looks quite marvelous and quite opulent and quite regal in that regard too. But I would argue, based on my research, that it is Sayaji Rao II who's responsible for introducing modern banking in Baroda. And he, in effect, becomes the chief banker of his own state, right? So in some senses, he coalesces or collapses these two functions, that of ruler and that of financier, into one. Very important moment in Indian history. Let me tell you what a contemporary account says about this. This is also from Eliot, for those who follow history. This is the 19th century. Sayaji Rao was a great banker. The central bank of Ganesh Ishwar in Baroda was set going in 1829. He had two establishments in his own palace, which yielded 125,000 rupees, and another bank in the city brought in 8,000 rupees. And he had branch banks across the city, right? And each of those brought in about 5,000 rupees. He thus increased his private fortune by 5 lakhs a year. And what he did not save was spent in disbursements to relations and dependents, large families of dependents, and in arena sports or shows, and alas, in scattering bribes and secret service money. Okay? If you're a ruler, you have to maintain your networks of information, and the bankers did the same thing too. We know that Shantidas Javeri, for example, the Haribhaktis, for example, and the Gaekwads had their own networks of information that overlapped, but also was different, right? My father always says, trust but verify. So they had a system of trust but verify in this time period too, okay? But this just shows you how quickly bankers were sort of sidelined for a moment, and how the Gaekwads themselves in some senses, saved their own state from the East India Company because they were being threatened with entire takeover. And so one counterfactual aspect of history is what happens if Sayaji Rao didn't bail out the state? Would we have the subsequent Gaikwads post 1829 or 1830? Maybe the East India Company would have taken it over, like they did with Ahmedabad, for example, and Baroda would have had a very different trajectory, right? And we know that much later, with Sayaji Rao III, some amazing institutions were developed in this particular city, educational institutions, financial institutions, and a different form of governance, right? So that may have not happened if it wasn't for Sayaji Rao II. For the Haribhakti fortune, let me tell you something that is very interesting. This is a testimony by Magan Bhai Haribhakti, a later member of the Haribhakti family. And this is not just a Haribhakti story. The Jhaveris in Ahmedabad also faced this. The Jagat Seths in Murshidabad also faced this. Most indigenous bankers in India faced this, which was the East India Company takeover of indigenous banking, criminalizing it, outlawing it, and essentially sidelining major banking families. I'll give you one example. It was very common among Marwadi bankers to gamble on rainfall. And they outlawed that and criminalized that. They outlawed hundis. They outlawed multiple currencies. Gujarat was a place, for example, where you had at least 15 to 20 different currencies circulating in a very complicated marketplace. They criminalized it and they outlawed it. So Magan Bhai Haribhakti, and you can see his agony shine through in this particular testimony. He says, the ancestors of His Highness the Gaekwad, so the early Gaekwads, looked upon this firm as their own bankers, and feelings of mutual confidence and friendship grew very strong between them. He's saying this in the colonial court, by the way, the British court. The firm of Haribhakti, in English, was ever ready with its purse, anxious to lay all its capital at its disposal, and once actually paid 80 lakh rupees to the Peshwa on behalf of the Gaekwad at a moment's notice. The members of this famous firm were the staunch adherents of the Gaekwad through thick and thin, through woe and weal, and their loyalty to the Gadi, or seat of princely authority, of Baroda, often put to several trials, proved absolutely unshaken through thick and thin. And in return, they were offered several Inami villages by the Gaekwads, who offered them this land, both as a resource, but also, Inam is both. It's also worth something and it also means something. So, cash allowances, and most importantly, they were given the hereditary office of being Bordar, or the chief treasurer of the Gaekwad state, along with other things, right? This is 1899, and Magan Haribhakti saying, we lost out. Post 1830, new challenges emerged. The colonial state is present and is dictating terms between local bankers and the Gaekwad state. And look, all these services that we provided early on, what about that work? What about the loans that we were not repaid? What do we do with that? And the colonial state, being revenue hungry and being fiscally smart, said, that's unfortunate. Okay? So again, I can tell you being an academic doesn't pay very well, but certainly you're not dealing with all of this. So business is not easy, right? And for those who are in the business of business, and for those who are in the business of politics, it's a high risk, high reward game. And I hope that over this last 45 minutes or so, you've seen how difficult and complicated the story has been. Let me just end by saying that the final punchline of the book and the argument is that it is in the process of Mughal decline and, of course, the rise of the Gaekwads that bankers were first implicated or kind of incorporated, then extorted, and then finally the bankers and the native rulers adapted to new political circumstances to innovate new businesses, such as ijara, for example, right, revenue farming, and other kinds of service and commodity businesses, and use the power of finance to try and shape political possibilities. Sometimes it worked very well, like in the early part of the Gaekwad regime. Sometimes it didn't work very well, like when their responsibilities and positions were taken away. But it is a song and dance that is still not complete. If you look around today in our own society, you see that business and politics is intertwined in very obvious ways. It was less obvious then. You can look to my home country, the United States. We have a new president. You can look to India. right? And again, we should not be shy or unabashed in talking about this. There's a very strong relationship between business and politics. And rather than taking sides, I just want you to think about it and reflect on it. We live in a so-called democracy here and in the US, both. And I'm saying so-called because democracies everywhere are so-called, right? They're always a work in progress. And we as citizens, as students, as informed public, have to always keep an eye out on how our world is changing around us. What are the mechanisms by which that change is affected? Who are the players that are involved? And most importantly, for a moment at least, suspending judgment, because we never have complete information. So the idea is to seek as much information as possible, try and synthesize it in as best a way as possible. And my attempt to do that is just one attempt among hopefully many. So even whatever I have written, please take with a grain of salt. And if you disagree, and if you have a different perspective, I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I apologize for going over. Where they owned slowly vast tracts of land. So the Javeris, for example, we know were involved in the buying and selling of saltpeter, which is an important commodity in gunpowder production, the buying and selling of indigo, which is extremely expensive in those days, and other commodities. For the Haribhakti fortune and the later Laubes, and they're no different than any other family, opium was a very big part of their business, and it was also the Gaekwad state business, absolutely. And again, as I told you, value judgments have to be suspended for a minute, right? It's very easy for us to paint historical characters in a particular way. The Tatas, by the way, also, for those who love the Tatas, also began in opium trading. And let me tell you a little bit about why this was the case, and let me tell you why it's important. There's a bigger story here. And that story is the British East India Company realized that the best way to not pay for Chinese porcelain and Chinese tea and not send silver there and gold there was to cultivate and grow opium in the Indian subcontinent and export that to China. So the tales that we have are not necessarily one of these bankers and rulers waking up one day and saying, we're going to cultivate opium. These cash crops, in some sense, were also forced, or at least these people were cajoled into growing them. And of course, they saw immense profits in it too, right? I mean, it's a drug after all, right? So yes, they made a huge fortune in that. What changed for the Haribhaktis is by 1870s or so, there was an act that was passed which outlawed local bankers and farmers from growing and cultivating opium. And the British East India Company said, we will take over your land again unless you nationalize or regionalize this particular industry. So the Gaekwads were forced to control the growing of opium, maintaining quality, maintaining prices, and so on and so forth, because again, China was hooked on opium by that time. A lot of this changes in the late 18th century with the American Civil War, when Indian cotton again becomes more valuable than opium. And so it is for this reason that the big merchants of Mumbai and Ahmedabad suddenly find themselves selling cotton to the global market and amassing huge fortunes. Bombay wouldn't be Bombay without cotton in the global market. So all this tells you is that, you know, we say, what is the responsibility of business in society, or what is the responsibility of a ruler in society? Part of that is their own will, but a lot of that is dictated by larger currents. And I guess the judgment should come from how any single actor tries to balance this larger force with their own individual activity. I think we all struggle with this every day, right? Some days we feel caught up in the whirlwind that is life, and we feel like it's beyond our control, but yet we're trying every day to cut sugar and to exercise more and to behave better, right? So this tug of war is something that these historical characters also faced. And I think it's extremely honest of everyone here, including the family and the Haribhakti family, to contend with this history, right? Again, it's a work in progress. This is just a piece of the puzzle. We have to know more. And I invite all the young people sitting in the back especially to join me. Like I said, I've only done 1%, 99 remains to be done. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah. What's that? Jeez. Yeah, thank you, yeah.
Also helps us understand not just the economics of the politics, but just how society worked. And I'm very interested in knowing how really were the Haribhaktis and Lal Bhais amassing this kind of wealth that they could, yes, yeah. So that's, I want to know whether it's opium.
So I've been collecting original lithographs of Ravi Verma's press. There's more than 3,000 probably in my collection. Yeah, I have been doing exhibitions. I've done more than 14 exhibitions in India. I will.
OM. Okay, nice.
I'm also researching on Baroda right now.
Okay.
And I'm seeing the medieval history of Baroda. I'm a student from MS History.
Lovely.
Sir, I would like to have a meeting regarding this.
Sure.
And I would also like to contribute to your research.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Sure, lovely. I'm not in town. Thank you. So we have to do it over Zoom or a phone call, but send me an email, and sometime in February. Yeah, because I'm traveling. Yeah, you can just find it online. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So, I and Om are together and we founded a society for youngsters.
Okay.
Who work for conserving heritage structures.
Okay, amazing. Really good. Yeah, please. That would be great. I'll be happy to come and support you, and we can have a chat first, and then let's do that. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Say it again. Erakar. Thar. Okay. Erakar. Nice name.
Prakhar. Nice name, Prakhar.